Hello, book lovers. We are here once again, Marisa Serafini, and
Svitek.
yes, in this month we are talking The Remains of the Day by one of my favorite authors, Kazuo Ishiguro. Oh my goodness. Written in 1988, published officially 1989, and then there was an actual movie adaptation in 1993, which garnered a lot of recognition and whatnot. We'll get to that later on, but real quick thoughts of this book, Phil.
I overall enjoyed it. It's a pretty quick read. It's a very engaging read. Plot wise, it's about this butler that essentially takes a vacation for the first time in many, many years, kind of at the nudge of his new employer. And then, as he's going through this, he kind of gives himself a purpose because he wants to go and reconnect with somebody who used to work for him, and bring him back into the fold. And yeah, that's kind of where it takes off. And overall, like I said, it is quite a page turner, right? And it's very philosophical and heady, so I liked it in that regard. It made much more of the butler case, like what is a butler, that became the main sort of driving force. Because in a way, that same reaction that Bradley Cooper has in Silver Linings Playbook at the end of reading one of Hemingway's books, A Farewell to Arms.
Yeah,
I was expecting it. I was expecting a different ending, and certainly, we'll talk about the ending. So this is fully going to be spoiler filled, but I wanted to avoid at least a little bit of the spoiler before I called out the spoiler warnings.
Absolutely. And that's so funny you bring up Call to Arms because we also covered that book years ago. You and I, also one of my favorite books ever. Sad book. Forewarning for anyone who hasn't read it. It's a classic. If you haven't read it now, what are you doing with your life? Great book. As I digress a little bit. Yeah, I really enjoyed The Remains of the Day. I really enjoy Ishiguro's writing style because maybe I'm just a fan of the nonlinear storytelling. And he writes in the way of there's always a current storyline, but his main protagonist is usually like reflecting back on past moments of the character's life, whether it be a woman or a man in whatever story, whatever book of his you're reading. And this one, we have the main butler. His character is named Mr. Stevens. And during, like you said, during his free time, in the first time in years, he finally has the moment to reflect on his life and his past career and all these meaningful events that happened in his life, but he was so wrapped up in his profession and his characteristics more so that they say hindsight is 2020. And as he's reflecting, he's like really realizing a lot of the flaws of his past choices, of his past words, past occurrences in his life that he's like, it's really opening up his eyes in that way. And I really like that because that in a way that's also big like character building aspect of when people realize like something such as that, and it really adds to their just the person's layers in that sense. And reading Mr. Stevens, and he has a very simple but very, very professional idealistic perspective of what makes a great butler and what defines the professionalism, how one is supposed to act, how one is supposed to behave towards people in different occurrences in life. And he realizes that, not to like get too forward, but it's that the whole idea of dignity, that's a recurring theme in this book. And he looks at the other people, such as his father, Mr. Stevens Sr., who was a big idol in his life. And he really, catered his personalities and behaviors and emulated being so professional and just kind of stuck in that, like, he doesn't show any human emotion. He has to remain stoic and a little bit emotionless to the point that it's too professional and it's too extreme, that it creates this facade that no one can actually get to him on a human level.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things about it is he very much identifies dignity and his professionalism of essentially just what it is to be a good person, right? So it becomes one and the same. So, that becomes his purpose in life, and it's all encompassing in that way. And even more so, especially now, part of the reflection is, can he maintain that extremely high standard that he has set for himself as he ages? Because certainly that was, for lack of a better term, the downfall of his father, the senior, right? Because he was starting to waver with age, and yet he didn't want to relent in any capacity, because he found it beneath himself. But that sort of acceptance of like what life ultimately is, and that you have to adopt, you have to change based on the circumstances in any given moment. But I think too, it's very easy to put yourself in his shoes, at least initially, at least like, maybe right up until the end, because it is very much like, it's Noble. He's basically pre-World War II times. And, he, as far as his employer, he feels that in his heart of hearts, like he's doing what's right for the world. And so it goes beyond just doing a good job. It's like, if I do a good job, I can help maintain peace, because this is important. And yet the war broke out, as we know through history, and then, just reflecting back on it. So it's like, did he actually have an effect? So, it becomes a lot of that. And it's like, well, what can you ultimately do, right? And certainly that gets challenged as he ventures out into the world, especially with the small town, and, the ones that are like, democracy, vote, and, we're doing our part here.
Right. And it's also, and I like the whole reflection narrative that Ishiguro writes with him, because like slowly we understand his belief in how professional he has to be in this Darlington Hall, the estate in which he works, and oversees a bunch of staff members who are, footmen and maids and all that, and like the servicemen taking care of this estate. And like, I think you and I both personally know that when you professionally work so hard and you give your all and your best to your employer, it does breach that line of what's loyal and what's just being professional. And it seems Mr. Stevens, he had such kind of a blind loyalty to his employer that he doesn't see the flaws. He oversees all the flaws of his employer, where he has so many encounters with other people that would come in and out of that estate, who are like dropping hints and being like, do you realize what your employer is doing? He's helping Germany. He's sympathizing with the Nazi regime. Like, do you not see that? All the signs are there. And he's like, it's not my professional place to have an opinion on that. It's not my job to add my 2 cents to whatever. He's like, my job is to serve the man who's employing me. It's like, I'm not supposed to have any idea or any, just like, he's not allowed to have his own thoughts about things.
Well, and
that's what's frustrating.
Yeah, where it really came to a head in that initial sense, because it's one thing to not know in the greater scope of, let's say, what's right and what's wrong or what's happening. But when his master essentially ordered him to fire the 2 Jewish servants, he knew that was incorrect, right? And that was the moment where it kind of came to a head, because whether or not, again, the outside factors, besides that, he knew this was wrong. He was challenged on it very directly by Miss Kent, and yet he went ahead and did it.
Miss Kenton, yes.
Yeah. So,
and Yeah, and so I think my question is when we saw this, because again, with the times of I mean, this book was written in the 80s, so it's not that far away from what actually happened during World War II, and even the story time of this book is set in the 30s, so very much during the World War II era. And then we had the dismissal of two female Jewish ladies. What were your opinions of this? I don't know, maybe being a man, I don't want to bring like, gender equality into this, but from your perspective reading this, what were your thoughts when he was
Well,
put into this position and the whole interaction with the other female household, the other head, like what's that? Not the headmistress, but
yeah, I mean, it wasn't even a matter of gender.
housekeeper.
It wasn't even a matter of gender at that point because, I mean, they were just extremely good at their jobs,
Right.
right? And and so in that sense, it was just egregious simply for the fact that they were Jewish, you know, because we saw earlier that he was being challenged because of his father. His father was actually messing up, things left and right, and yet he was willing to take a stand for his father because of the nature of it, right? Because his father had this reputation, and so one can overlook certain things. And it wasn't until the Lord actually came to him and he said, like, we have a really big dinner coming up. We can't mess this up. And that's when he essentially, had to swallow his pride about his dad and kind of, do what was needed. And in this sense, someone who is very deserving, he kind of forewent that injustice simply because, he thought it would help. And I understand why, like, that the idea that you're talking about, that this blind trust of who he's serving. He really believed in his heart of heart that his master knew better than him, that this, in theory, could help keep and maintain peace in Europe. So it's one of those things of utilitarianism, right? Like, okay, yes, a few people here and there might suffer, but overall, we're going to maintain the peace. So I understand he was between a rock and a hard place, but it was just very interesting, that comparison between he was willing to stand up for his father, who was terrible, versus these two women who were exemplary.
Yeah, and deserving. And I want to get your thoughts about Miss Kenton. So she's basically the female equivalent of him, and the complete foil in that sense that he is so stoic and unemotional, that she is the more nurturing, she's the more caring, and when something bothers her, she lets us know, and she actually points out why things are wrong. So I want to get your opinion about Miss Kenton and how she played a big role into his life, with him kind of finally realizing that during his reflection.
I thought she was great. And in the words of Mr. Stevens, that is to say, she was fantastic. He used a lot of that is to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I thought she was perfect. And in many ways, like, this is the crux of the whole thing for me, was that I thought he was going to realize that he loved her and that he would finally say what needed to be said, because he had that, like, she's there. This is, let's say, near the end or three quarters towards the end, where, she just accepted a proposal and she's like, unless you have anything to say,
Right.
I am going to take this.
Right.
And
I'm
like,
still thinking about it.
and he's very much like, nope, you do you. She's like, okay, but if you say something, I may reconsider here. And so he doesn't do it then, right? But this is the past.
Mm-hmm.
And then we cut to the future, and he still is thick-skulled as ever and doesn't say anything to her, even though she just left her husband again, who she doesn't like.
Again, for the third time, mind you, because when we see, I mean, honestly, being the woman, I was like, okay, great. We have another woman in the house who's like keeping him in check in that sense. And I love the fact that she did bring the emotion to someone who's like just so caught up in being so professional, that he couldn't show anything
And I just want to start
and yeah.
I just want to point out her emotional side did not get in the way of her work side.
No. And I love she got upset when needed, and she pointed out the wrong things when it needed to be pointed out, because and like that's what I really respect Miss Kenton for. I was like, okay, finally we got some humanity laced throughout this book. And being the woman, I was like, are they ever gonna get together? Because she's definitely dropping hints that, like, oh hey, I respect you. There are so many things about your life that brings me joy and all that. And then when Mr. Stevens is reflecting, and they finally meet up again after all these years, because she leaves the house to get married, but when they finally meet up and he genuinely asks her a very personal question, it's like, were you ever happy? You're like, no, I wasn't. But I eventually got to the point where I got happy and finally fell in love with the man that I married. But and then there's an amazing quote. For instance, I get to thinking about a life I may have had with you, Mr. Stevens. And I suppose that's when I get angry over some trivial little thing and leave her husband again. But each time I do so, I realize before long my rightful place is with my husband. One can't be forever dwelling on what might have been. I'm like, it's one of those things like missed opportunity. If he had been so wrapped up in his professional elite status and personality, they could have had a chance together. And that's so frustrating, where like the whole what could have been moment. And that when she said that she left her husband finally for the third time, like, this is your chance, guy, dude, like, jump on it. She's there, you're there, get together. And it didn't happen.
And we don't get,
I was upset about that.
We don't get any information about her actual husband, but it's interesting, like how she gives him a lot of credit, because he's never like been wrong to her. He's always accepting of her, return. And ultimately, like, she shared, it seems like, a lot about Mr. Stevens to him, and he's never seen, from the sounds of it, jealous, right? Again, we don't have any like account of any of these conversations, but I don't know. It's very interesting. Like, just how love can be so passionate, because I think Miss Kenton still deep down loves Mr. Stevens, and yet I don't know. They just don't seem right for each other, and I think she ended up with,
the right person.
Yeah, objectively a better person.
A better person who actually could take care of her, who actually could show emotion in that sense. And it just, as a reader, it makes you think, had he been a person who wasn't so dedicated to his job and could actually, just be a normal human being with feelings, like, what would he have turned out? Could he have fallen in love with someone and gotten married? Again, with the whole, he just took his job to the extreme, which is frustrating. And his reflection of that, you see him like really regret his actions in the past, because he's like, oh, I could have reacted that way, or I could have said something when that happened. And hindsight was really hurting him.
Yeah, I mean, what did you think about the part? Because the two sections where he gets really questioned was in the village about the idea everyone has a part to play, and everyone needs to be engaged, and yet that counters to his experience from a while ago, where he was essentially brought in to be made a mockery of like, hey, Stevens, what do you think of this? He's like, I don't know, and then it just became like the thing of asking him questions. He's like, I really don't know. And so the crux of it is, can you have, if you have uninformed citizens, how can you value their opinion, right? And it's like, yeah, it gets to the heart of what democracy ultimately is, and is it worthwhile? It is not, essentially. And he certainly, at least initially, came from that side of, yeah, if I'm uninformed on opinion, I better step back.
Right. And I think the interesting thing is like you see this duality of his character, and like a slight dichotomy as well, is that he's kind of a different person in two different settings. When the first setting, when he was brought in just to be kind of made fun of, and they asked him his political worldly views on the world affairs, and he's like, it's I can't help you in this instance because it's not his job to have an opinion. And then the guys are like, you see, this is why the world doesn't work, because we're doing it for people of gentleman status, like such as him, who actually can't form an opinion. So what's the point? And then on the flip side of that, when he's in the town and all those regular, I don't want to call them lowly, but like just the regular citizens of that country, and they see him as this symbol of status, being associated with people of power in that sense. They're like, oh wow, it must have been great to be in the eyes and in the presence of these people who are actually doing things for the world. It's just weird to see the two different sides. Like, oh, someone like the high people thought lowly of him, and the lower people thought highly of him, and he's just kind of caught in the middle. And I thought it was interesting because in both settings, he's like, I can't really say anything.
I mean, yes and no. Like, I think, the foil really is Miss Kenton, because she proves that essentially both are possible. It's possible to have an opinion. It's possible to show emotion while still being great at your job, while still maintaining professionalism. Because when I look at it, the townspeople, though they don't have the same access to information and, people, they're still engaged and want to be engaged and put in that effort. Whereas, he does have all these things and he takes it for granted, and because he thinks he shouldn't have an opinion. And it's like, again, you might not have always the best opinion, but just the ability to try to engage and discern your own morality for your own self, right?
Right.
Where he essentially just offloads that to somebody else. And I think that's what he's realizing is, he's let someone else live his life, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's also is interesting is that, when we see him reflecting on his past, he's so dedicated to Lord Darlington. And then when we see him in the present, and people are talking about, oh, well, what was it like to work with him? He completely denies the fact that he ever was associated with him, because of Darlington's past, being labeled as a Nazi sympathizer and giving into the regime, unfortunately. Is that it's just him, realizing his past flaws. It's like, oh, I dedicated an entire career to the wrong man, to a person of lower morality, as you said.
Did you read it that, because like there was an interesting part.
I kind of read it that way, that like he regrets his career choices for the man that he thought so highly at one point.
I would have bought that if like the ending was a little bit different, because like I question at the end how much he actually learned. And there is that part where he says to Mr. Faraday, his
current employer,
his current employer, who's also American, and I think that makes a distinction because like he has much more of a humorous side than his past employer, Lord Darlington. But anyway, to Faraday, he says, "Oh, it's not tradition here in Britain to talk about who we worked for in the past." Or however he said it. And so I don't know. I don't know the cultural norm, so I'm willing to sort of buy that, especially since he is so like all about tradition, and the fact that I don't know. By the end, I just don't think he changed that much. Maybe by the end, when that person on the bench tells him about the remains of the day, I think he there realized it of like, yeah, my life sucks, but I guess I will enjoy what I have left.
Well, I didn't see him saying like my life sucks. See, this is why I love our discussions, because we always have two different opinions. But I think it's more so, it's nice to see how he treats his American employer compared to his past. I kind of do agree with your question, like how much has he changed? I don't think he changed all that much, but reflection, it made him realize the error of his ways. And I think that in itself is a character growth moment for him. And that's what makes all of his past blind loyalty in that way kind of, I don't want to say acceptable, but like you understand what he was put in, like bad positions back then, but what could you do? And again, it's that whole question like, oh, I should have, or I would have, that whole should have, could have moment, with 2020 hindsight.
Yeah,
and I like that because he's like, all right, yeah, that was wrong. I should have acted that way instead.
and I think it's while it's not explicit, I think there's a worry about, I don't know, the future of it all, right? Because I think, he was so, let's say, easily manipulated, for lack of a better term, or just, blindsided with optimism, and yet it didn't work out, right? Because at the end of the day, whether, he did what was right or wrong, he did it from a place of like goodness, right? Like he really tried his best as he saw fit. And it kind of led to this. And now, part of his whole reflecting is, what's his place in all of this? The world is changing. No longer is the staff what it used to be. Like, they had like 4 members at this point. Maybe for a big event, they bring in some people, but they're down to 4. It's not what it used to be. And so it's like, yeah, I mean, the world's just in general changing post World War II. And, what does that mean for, an old dinosaur like him, so to speak?
Right. And there was also that moment where he even admits it out loud. He's like, I gave my best years and my best service to this man who, kind of failed me on that level. And now I'm an older man and I just don't have it in me anymore to serve at that high status and standard that he once was. And I think that was another growing point for him. He's like, hey, I'm not as great as I used to be, realizing his flaws, but also, and again, it's the whole meaning of the book, It Remains of the Day. It's like, yeah, what I did in my past, it's bad, but now that I'm in my later years, like I gotta enjoy what time I have left, the remains of the day. Like let's what's the quote? For a great many people, the evening is the most enjoyable part of the day. Perhaps then there is something to his advice that I should cease looking back so much, that I should adopt a more positive outlook and try to make the best of the remains of the day. It's like, yeah, you might have a sordid history, but that doesn't mean you can make the best of the future and what's left of whatever time he has left. And I like that. That's a good message overall for the book and for the character.
It is. I just don't know what he does with it. You know what I mean? Like, he doesn't get the girl. I don't think he's like going to make this grand gesture of quitting and like going off and seeing everything else because he hasn't really seen the world at all. I mean, that first stop, right? He's driving and there's that beautiful view, and the guy tells him, you're not going to get a better view than this. So he's like, okay, he debates with himself. Should I see such a beautiful view now, or like hold it off until later? And he sees it, and it really was gorgeous. And yet it wasn't that far from where he lived.
Yeah. And like, even when he's first traveling out, there's that moment where he's like, yeah, this area I recognize, but slowly I was getting past the point where I got to this area that I had never been, and like opening his eyes, and he's like finally getting out of his hometown or that home area, which he has dedicated his whole life to. It's like finally seeing the world, and it is a little too late. And it kind of reflects that in the movie adaptation as well, because with the whole reflection of Anthony Hopkins' character, he plays Mr. Stevens near the end, not to jump totally ahead and over the book or like over the movie, is that near the end, he actually does return after seeing Miss Kenton. He does return to that estate, and he just keeps going back to his job and keeps living his life, and the movie kind of ends there. So it does bring up the question, like, does he change his life just because now he knows the flaws in his past, but like, does he actually change his ways of going about things? We don't know. He just goes back to the life he knows.
Which, I mean, in some ways, like, is admirable, right? Like, the difference between living in hell and heaven can be just a matter of perspective shift, right? Like, you don't actually have to physically change what you're doing. It's just a matter of like, oh, if I wake up, do I dread the day or do I enjoy the day? So, it could be in that sense, but at least with the, unlike with a movie, you can get much more internal with a book. And certainly this is like his musings, his writings. And I don't know. I hopefully, like, I just want, because I spent so much time in his damn, sad mind, I just want him to be happy.
Right. Be like, was this all worth for nothing? Do you at least have some happiness or some positive outlook for your future? We don't know, because the book kind of ends there. And also the movie ends there too. So like, in a way that could be frustrating to your reader, like, I wanted to know more, but I think in a good way, it also just makes us reflect, did anything else happen? It makes us think. It's very ambiguous.
It's very frustrating that all I needed him to say was like,
it is frustrating.
I took a deep breath of the crisp air and was excited for whatever may have come. Like, I just needed something.
Something to say that he's happy.
Yes. Which I guess, again, that he will enjoy the remains of his day, is very poetic. So maybe that's it. And maybe I'm just not accepting it. I don't know.
Okay. But I mean, I can kind of agree with that too, but it's a little too open-ended for us to understand if he's happy or not, especially when he even realizes that Miss Kenton wasn't happy. But ultimately, she says she did find happiness. But like, does he himself, can he find happiness? That is the question.
Well, her unhappiness really comes from whenever she revisits the past, right? And she's berating herself of like, I mean, she's having a fantasy of what could have been, but that's all it is. Like, Mr. Stevens has shown his cards, right? He's who, and I think that the frustration for Miss Kenton is this idea that she, kept trying to believe that he was ever going to change. And it was like, I'm just deluding myself. And even now, like, whatever, 20 or so years later, she still thought that maybe he could change. And it's like, this dude is not going to change.
Nope. And she's just going to probably go back to her husband, even though she says that they're divorced finally. But like, and I gotta, I just want to hug Miss Kenton for like trying to believe or try to see the best in Mr. Stevens. Oh, hi, Chloe. The patience that she had with him to finally wait for the day that, oh, he might actually be a human being underneath that facade of dignity that he has. And when they finally meet up and he is still the same person that she always knew, like, nope, I better stop because I'm just going to keep hurting myself believing that he's ever going to change.
Yeah.
So, as a woman, that really hurt.
Yeah. And I think, I'm of the belief that you can show humanity at your job, right? And so when her aunt passes away, when she makes the declaration that, she's meeting somebody that she might get engaged, and he just literally shows no emotion, as we talked about. And I think that plays in great contrast with his new American employer, who's, for all intents and purposes, much more jovial, informal with Stevens. And Stevens, he tries to crack a joke, and then he just, because he's never really done it, it just fails miserably.
Right.
Like, what do you want about Stevens?
Right. It's out of character for him. And then we see like the book kind of begins and ends with the whole idea of bantering, because just the act of bantering shows, witticism and humor, and you have to have like a sense of humor to banter, and which is like nothing that we ever got with Mr. Stevens throughout the book. And then at the end, when he agrees, he's like, I'm going to try to learn bantering. I'm going to try to, like, I think maybe to answer our earlier questions, like maybe this is his opportunities. Like, I'm going to try to actually have a sense of humor. I'm going to try to be more personable. He has the idea or the thought that he's going to put an actual action into trying to change his personality a bit.
What did you think of the doctor scene? Because I thought it didn't go as hard. Because when the doctor calls out him of like, you're not really a sir, are you? And I thought that was, I don't know, I thought it was going to be more contemptuous than it ended up being.
Oh, when Dr. Carlisle?
Yeah, so he gets the ride,
Right.
That's 7:30 in the morning to his car and all that.
Back to his car. I like that because it took, sometimes it takes strangers to just say things about yourself that because you don't have that personal relationship. It's like you can say things that normally you probably shouldn't, but because they're strangers, he was so open about it, and I'm like, I like that because like, yeah, we understand that you had a very professional career and you knew a lot of people, but that doesn't mean like in his eyes that really doesn't mean anything. And I like that. So it really took that small town of all those little nice hospitable strangers for him to kind of open up a little bit. And sometimes strangers brings out the best in people.
Yeah, for sure. And he was so reluctant against it. I get it, you're traveling and whatnot, but it's like, they're offering you free dinner, free drinks, free housing, like
free petrol.
Yeah, just hang out with the people. That's all they want. They don't get, new faces.
Right. And he kept trying to like retire and like leave because I think he was just starting to get overwhelmed by all these people just trying to know about him. And which is, the opposite of what he spent his whole career of. Like he served people and he left. No one knew anything about him. And like these people knew him for like a second. They were wanting to know all about his life. And it was kind of overwhelming for him.
It was because he hid in the shadows. Even in the room, he was just literally just not there. That was his whole ambition.
He just became that wallflower. And I liked it because, it was forcing him out of his comfort zone, which he needed. In that way, he really needed. So if you haven't seen the movie, there's 1993 movie, big cast, even like, a big recognizable cast now, but even back then, you have Anthony Hopkins, of course, Sir Anthony Hopkins, Emma Thompson, who played Miss Kenton. Mr. Faraday was played, the character Mr. Faraday kind of changes in the movie. It changes to a character named Congressman Lewis, who's also American, but he was played by Christopher Reeve, Hello Superman. And then we had Lord Darlington, who was James Fox, another famous actor back in the 90s. And then the Cardinal was a young Hugh Grant. And Lizzie, the character of Lisa, who is the woman who came in after they fired the two Jewish girls, that character was named Lisa. Her character was changed to Lizzie in the movie, played by a young Nina Headey. So just those names alone, if you haven't read the book, just watch the movie for them because, amazing actors all in their own right. And it got a lot of recognition back in 1993. It was nominated for 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Actor, Actress, Director, Art Direction, Costume Design, Original Score, and Adapted Screenplay. Unfortunately, it didn't win any of those awards, but it got a lot of recognition. And in 1999, the British Film Institute ranked it the 64th greatest British film of the 20th century. It has a 95% on Rotten Tomatoes. So that's high. You and I, we both know that's a high rating. And on the Cinema Scores, rated A-, and Metacritic gave it an 86. So like still high ratings 20 plus years later. they're going on 30, honestly.
Yeah, I
So
mean, I know
good
it
for
because
them.
Robert McKeon, his seminar and his writings, he often talks about this book simply because, it knows how to dramatize the internal,
Yeah.
where
And
yeah.
oh yeah, keep sorry.
No,
Go
just where like seemingly it's the most mundane thing in the world about a butler just driving and reflecting, and yet it makes one of the most gripping human stories ever.
Right. What I think personally, because I don't want to delve too deep into the movie, especially if you haven't seen it, but just as a viewer of the movie, I mean, we read the book and we're so engrossed in Mr. Stevens' mind and his personal narrative that when you get to the movie, you kind of hear two different voices. You hear Miss Kenton's voice and Mr. Stevens. So you're like, who are we following every once in a while? Which is kind of nice. There are moments you get out of Stevens' head and you see the world from someone else's perspective.
Yeah, I
Whereas
don't want to
book, it
stay.
is just Mr. Stevens.
Yeah, sometimes we got to get out of Mr. Stevens' head. He's quite the
Right.
pessimist, quite the
So
downer.
yeah, and I think that's the good thing with the movie is like there is a balance of different characters that you finally see it from different perspectives, and you as the viewer kind of understand what's happening in the world, and kind of opens up the opportunity for you to make your own opinions compared to just seeing Mr. Stevens and how he sees the world.
Yeah.
I
Well, you can
like that.
still, I mean, with the book, you still get to make up your own, fact of it, right? Because, I mean, ultimately, he is talking to somebody, right? AKA like the reader. He doesn't know who the
Mhm.
reader is, but, he's communicating with somebody. That is to say, as he says often, right? So he's trying to convey these thoughts. And in many ways, it's almost funny because in all the moments that he's trying to justify it for us, it's almost like he's really trying to just make himself believe his own bullshit.
Yeah, or believe like his past actions are justified based
Yeah.
on the times and the people that he served with. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So a little bit about the author Kazuo Ishiguro. This isn't personally our first book of his that we've read. He has a lot of accolades. I mean, he is the in 2017 he received the Nobel Prize in Literature, and he's very well sought out in UK. Yeah, like his family born in Nagasaki, and his family at a young age moved actually to Britain. And from there, he actually got involved with the British government and learned a lot about politics growing up in that way. And that's why most of his books have, UK and Britain, historical references and that type of writing for him. And like I mean, he's written a lot. The Unconsoled, When We Were Orphans, Never Let Me Go, which is actually one of my personal favorite books ever. The Buried and Nocturnes, Five Stories, Music and Nightfall, which was, I believe, actually the a profile of Arthur J. Mason was actually when he was in America, and that was kind of the crux and the catalyst for him writing this book, because that story dealt with a butler as well. So it was a nice preface to this book. Yeah, I mean, I really like his writing style, the whole, nonlinear reflection. I don't know, it speaks to me in that sense.
Yeah. It, there's a quote in soccer that says, soccer isn't life and death. It's much more important than that. And I feel like if you applied that towards being a butler, that would have been like the crux of, Mr. Stevens' principal aspect. And ultimately, like I appreciate, I mean, if nothing else, like it's a wonderful look into a life that I'm not familiar with, right? And it certainly makes me appreciate, what it takes just to be in the service industry in general, right? Whether it be at a restaurant or anywhere else. These are all the politics, the hardships and so forth that you're dealing with at any of these places. And so I hope that resonates with readers as well.
Absolutely. I agree. So anything else about this book that you'd like to wrap up about your thoughts of this story?
No, I thought it was well written, well paced, engaging, and I think to a degree humorous. I don't think it's a straight out comedy, but I think I like to believe that the author knew the humor he was inserting into Mr. Stevens because of his lack of humanity, and it did make me chuckle, a couple of times. So
yeah, and as a reader, there are just sometimes, you just kind of want to shake the character, like, wake up, what's wrong with you? But when that slow burn of when Mr. Stevens finally realizes like the wrong things he did, you're like, okay, that's all you need and want for his character to like finally realize like, oh, that was wrong. I should do better. And that I like as a character growth moment. All right, so our next book is Saturday by Ian McEwan.
Not this Saturday.
Choice.
It is the title
of this upcoming Saturday. Our next
the title of the book.
It's called Saturday. So, Phil, what makes you want for us to read this one?
So Ian McEwan, much like Ishiguro for you, he's one of my top authors. In there with like a Neil Gaiman and other such people. And yeah, so I'm slowly want to kind of go down his writings, and this seemed short enough. It seemed interesting enough. It's about a post 2000, well, more specifically a post 9/11 world. We're going to keep in theme with Britain. So that was unintentional, but yeah, and I think very much so. Whereas in this book, he's very much reflecting on like, his career. This is about a person reflecting back on like quite literally the day, but also, his politics and his ideology and life. So I think there's going to be a lot of similarities, again, unintentionally, but I think it'll be fun. And then we talk about Hercule Poirot's Christmas by Agatha Christie in December.
This will be a very fitting December Christmas book. I'm excited to read it. I'm a big fan of mystery and thriller and humor laced underneath and throughout. Yeah, so we have a reading cut out for us. Those are our two books for the rest of the year, and then we'll get into 2023. That's crazy.
Well, I'm
really looking forward to them.
Well, because I really love Ursula Le Guin, and I don't think she gets the credit as like not only is she a great sci-fi author, and she's not like put up into that pedestal. She's an amazing writer in general, and I don't think she gets the credit that she deserves. So for January, as of now, at least unofficially, maybe hopefully officially, the word for world is forest. It's a very quick book. I think it's like 170 pages. I thought that'd be a nice little introduction for readers.
Oh, nice. I'm excited to read it. I've heard about Ursula. Also, that I believe that book came out in the 80s back then.
Yeah.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but so yeah, we have a lot of fun, interesting books down the pipeline, and I'm excited to get to all of them.
Yeah, Ursula Le Guin is like from Madeleine L'Engle's sort of time period of writing.
Oh yeah, love Madeleine L'Engle. Read all of hers. She's great. So yeah, really excited for that. All right. Thank you everyone for listening and watching. Phil, where can everyone follow you?
At Phil Svitek, and here every month with Marisa talking books.
There we go. And you can follow me at Serafini TV. Thank you, everybody. Keep reading, keep watching.